All right. Hello, everybody. Hello. Nice. I just came from Turku. Like, really nice to come here to talk in Helsinki. Also, I see that the community here is a lot bigger than we have in Turku. So really, really nice. And thank you, everybody, for coming to check this out today. And I was really pleased to come and join you to talk about web components. Anybody here know what web components are? All right, so about 50%. That's awesome. Anyway, my full name is Sami Suo-Heikki. You can find me on Twitter, GitHub. I have nice track record in GitHub going on at the moment, so please check it out. I actually just a few weeks ago joined Reactor as they opened their offices in Turku. And also a small entrepreneur. I have Identio as my startup thing. But anyway, I'm today here talking about web components. And before Reactor, I was in a company called Vaadin in Turku. And their whole new business is to create web components for business applications. So pretty much my last couple of years have been going on with web components, and really pleased to talk to you about them today. So I have one simple example what web components look like and how we can use them. So I've created this cool element which was also presented by some Google engineers in their own Polymer Summit, which was really cool. But I've created this Pokemon selector, and it is a web component. And how today we can use web components is to use this new standard with HTML imports. So HTML imports, they work pretty much the same way as importing some CSS files in your application. But instead of importing CSS, you're importing entire HTML files. And if you want to use this Pokemon selector, the only thing that we need to do after the import is to actually set up the Pokemon selector tag in our application, and the output should be something like this. So you can type, you can scroll to the drop down and select your favorite Pokemon from there. Really cool element. But of course, who wants to create entire application by just using one element? Thankfully for this purpose, there's this really cool site called the webcomponents.org. And the webcomponents.org is kind of like an online catalog for all of the web components built by companies or by just single developers. And the site currently has over 1,200 building blocks for your application. And cool thing about them is that they all work pretty much the same way. So you simply just import them, or install, import, and then use them. Usually when I talk about web components, I like to compare web components to Legos. I put this t-shirt today morning, actually entirely on purpose, because if you're, for example, building with Legos, you have these simple blocks, but you can't really do any cool stuff with just one block. But when you have 100 or 1,000 blocks, then you can start building some really cool shit like spaceships or medieval castles. And that is really the same promise that web components promises. So you have these single elements, for example, Pokemon selectors and routing and buttons and stuff like that, and them itself doesn't do much. But when you combine them, use all of them, then you have really cool application with little few coding. Next up, I can present a bit about the history of web components. So web components were first presented or talked about about 6 years ago by Google engineer called Alex Russell. So they were in this meetup called Frontiers in California, and his speak was about web components and model-driven views. So that is really what sparked up the web component and got things rolling out. And then a couple of years after that, Google, with Alex Russell of course, released the 0.1 version of this Polymer library. And Polymer, it is a web component library built by Google, and its just single purpose is to help developers to create custom elements more easily. So they have some boilerplate code in there, and also like some easier APIs and cool features like data binding. So when 0.1 was released, there was like huge spike in interest about web components, but pretty much the next thing that people notice is that these web components are not that well supported in browsers. So that put the interest a bit down, and then when you didn't have any browser support, what you should do? Well, maybe take some alternatives, for example, React. And that was pretty much the end of web components as we know it. Of course not. A couple of years ago, there was some more involvement by the community around web components. Xtag, which is another library that is built by Microsoft, their 1.0 release was done in early 2015, so about 2 years ago. And after that, the interest towards web components started to a bit spike up again. And not too late from that, also Polymer 1.0 major release was released, so few years after the 0.1 was released. And as the people in Google, they used to say that the 0.1 version was just to like find out what or how should we build applications and elements in the future, and then start building like tools how we can do it today. So the 0.1 was pretty much like an experiment how we can do this, and then the 1.0 was already like production ready stuff that we can actually use in our business or like any free time applications. After that, also one of my favorites called the HelsinkiJS. HelsinkiJS is a library built by Trey Shurgart, who is a developer at Atlassian, but on his free time he has built this like really cool and high-level library for building web components called HelsinkiJS. Definitely worth looking at. And not too late after that, there were some major changes towards web components. So the whole specifications, like what web components meant and so on, got their 1.0 version. So now we had like some really like cool info on how web component should actually work. And at the same time, when the new specifications and polyfills for them were released, the Polymer 2.0 version was released also. So a bit on the May 2017, so this year. And if you're wondering what the polyfills mean, polyfills is actually like just a simple JavaScript file that you can use in your application, and that will actually polyfill all the missing features that the browsers don't have and add them. But of course, like the minus part about polyfills is that you have to download some extra KPs in your application, and of course they're a bit slower than the native versions. And where are we today and where are we going? Right now there's been like really active development around web components. So for example, the Ionic team, they released the stencil tool like a month ago or something like that. And actually the whole Ionic platform will start using web components in the future. At the same time, Polymer 3.0 preview was released, so some cool new stuff for the Polymer library. And then some other JavaScript frameworks have already been starting to adopt web components also, for example, Svelte. So that was kind of like the brief introduction on the history of web components. Next up, I will talk a bit about the whole technical aspect on web components, of what web components are and what are the forces behind it. So the web component standards, they include 4 different four different specifications. And the first specification is custom elements. And custom elements is a really simple thing. It just means that browsers should be able to render these our own custom-made elements. And they should work exactly the same as native HTML elements. So that is the spec number one. Spec number two was something that we already saw. It was called the HTML imports, meaning that we can actually import whole HTML files in our apps. And the third part was something that we not discussed yet. It's called templates. And template is this kind of like simple tool that you can wrap some parts of your application inside a template. And when you load your application, the content of that template won't actually be loaded and the resources won't be fetched. So that means that you can actually write some of your HTML in forward and then use it only at the moment that we actually need it. And then the last specification is called Shadow DOM. And Shadow DOM is like really, it's kind of like complex for the browsers to implement. But what it really means is that we can actually scope our custom elements to be totally separated from our application's DOM. Meaning that if we put some CSS rules or some for example CSS rules, those CSS rules should not affect anything that is inside the Shadow DOM. Meaning that if we create these reusable custom elements, we know that they work exactly the same way. Doesn't matter what the application is or what framework it is using. And that is really like, I think that is the biggest promise that web components bring, is that you can build your elements just once and then reuse them in all of your application. Doesn't matter what the stack is. I already mentioned about the browser support, and we can check it out how the browser support for web components is looking right now. So templates, which was like a really simple thing for the browser vendors to implement, is already shipped across all the major evergreen browsers. Even Edge supports it. The next up was the custom elements, and custom element is currently natively supported in Chrome and Safari, but at the moment Firefox is already developing their support for custom elements. And about Edge, well, somebody has to call Microsoft to do some work. Yeah, pretty much the same thing about Shadow DOM. So it's supported in Chrome, supported in Safari. Firefox is developing it. Actually, I just heard like 30 minutes ago is that Firefox will deploy their stable release of Shadow DOM at the end of this year, which is really cool stuff. But then there's another part that we didn't actually discuss yet, and which is actually not part of the HTML specs. But there's one line with ES6 modules. Anybody here used ES6 modules? Okay, about 30%. Those are really awesome. And the same part, or at the same time, also like engineers at Google who are building Polymer and so on, have discovered that this HTML import style doesn't really work with other JavaScript frameworks or doesn't really solve any new problems. So instead of using HTML imports, I think the web components are moving a bit more towards using ES6 modules. So for example, I was talking about Polymer library. Polymer 2.0 will actually, it uses the HTML imports, but the 3.0 will actually totally discard the HTML imports and start using ES6 modules. So things are going in a right direction. Anybody know what this bird is? Yeah, what is it? Bower. Yes, bower. Who here likes bower? Yeah, that's the thing that I knew. So nobody raised their hands. Nobody likes bower. few months ago, I think when I did Bower install with some of the Polymer elements, I already noticed that Bower is actually like not supported anymore. Please don't use it. And I was like, what? Okay, well, it still works at least. But yeah, previously, for example, the Polymer library has heavily depended on using Bower. And Bower has some like cool features, for example, allowing elements or allowing modules to have like flat dependencies, meaning that once we are installing, for example, Pokemon selector, we know that in our directory we have only one version of Pokemon selector. It doesn't make sense that we would have multiple of them. But this was a really cool animation. Yeah. This is where we're going in the future. So, for example, the Polymer 3.0, they have already ditched Bower, which is, I think, is a really cool thing. But it's not really sure that will they support NPM by default, or will they require the use of Yarn? Because, for example, at the moment, only Yarn supports flat dependencies when installing them. So at least the Polymer 3.0 still requires to use Yarn. But I would really much like that we can ditch Yarn too and just use NPM 5.
Why?
Why about NPM 5 or about Yarn?
About Yarn.
Yeah, I think if you look, I can go to the previous slide. If you look at Yarn versus NPM 5, I think Yarn was published like few months before NPM 5, and right now the NPM 5, I think that solves pretty much the same problems and has the same kind of features.
I don't think it has the log file though.
Yeah, the NPM 5 has log file also too. Yeah.
Yarn did recently come out version 1.0, which has some new features, though.
Yeah.
Workspaces, which is like NPM more flexible, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're both well with still for sure.
And
Yeah.
they broke the publish command. The Yarn publish is broken.
Well, I'm surprised.
Yeah, so one more reason to use NPM then. Yeah, just kidding, just kidding.
Yeah, we'll see how it goes.
Yeah, earlier in my presentation I was talking about that once you build your elements, you can use them in any stack. And that is, of course, the ideal world. But of course, in reality, things are not that simple. There's this really cool site called customelementseverywhere.com, which is built by one of the Chrome engineers, Rob Dunson. And he has just listed like pretty much the most popular JavaScript frameworks and how web components work in them. For example, they work perfectly on Vue, perfectly on Angular, but not so great, for example, with React at the moment. But I'm really hoping that in the future, for example, during this year, all of these frameworks in here would reach the 30 out of 30 score. So, but at least we are moving all the time towards being more supported in all of the frameworks too. Yeah, here's just some logos that I added about the current frameworks out there. I think the biggest one still is Polymer, but for example, HelsinkiJS, Stencil are already catching up. And also, if you want some cool elements for your business apps, I recommend the Vaadin elements that I built for 2 years. Really great. But also there are some smaller players still in town, for example, Slim.js. But it's really nice to see that there's more involvement all the time. Then, this was something that I was dreading about, doing a live demo. Anybody have done live coding in front of audience? Only a couple. Hopefully, good memories out of that. But anyway, I was just thinking that I would create a simple Hello World application, or Hello World element, I mean. So I have here my index.html file that has one script that loads the Hello World JS file, and then in the body I have just the hello world tags, and I can maybe zoom this a bit. And if everybody can see it, right? Yeah. All right, cool. So yeah, what I want to do is that this hello world tag would output, of course, hello world in it. Currently, my hello world JS is totally empty, and if we look at our site, it's is still totally empty. The browser still sees that, hey, there's some hello world tag in here, but of course we haven't registered that as a custom element, so meaning it won't be showing anything. But let's get our hands dirty then. Let's check out what it looks like. So I was talking about templates, and with templates we can actually create these, well, reusable templates that we can use in our application, or I mean in our elements. And cool part about these templates is that once I put document.not_template.create element template. Yeah, cool thing about this is that once I create the inner HTML of my template, the whole content will actually be totally separated from the rest of my application's DOM. Meaning that I can, for example, create style tags here. Style. And then use this cool feature called the host selector. And if I use host selector inside Shadow DOM, the host selector will actually mean the current element that I'm using. And a really cool, or like a common way of creating your elements is to add display block for the element. So they will work pretty much the same way as normal divs. And as I was saying, I would want to create a hello world example in here. So let's say hello world. All right, cool. Does it work? No, of course, I'm still missing some parts. We only have template in here and we are not using it anywhere. So next up, we will actually create a new, let's say, hello world class. And as we want to create a custom element, we can extend the native HTML element class. So that means that the hello world will actually inherit all the same features that normal HTML elements have. And then the last part here is to use window.customelements, and there is a define function. And with the define function, it requires two parameters: the name of the custom element and also the constructor. So the name we want to specify as hello-world, and then the constructor with the hello world. Let's see how it looks. Still nothing. But actually, we have already now defined hello world tag in here. So this is right now like a valid HTML element already. But of course, the template lies here totally unused. We want to use that next. So let's create constructor. Super. All right, cool. And then we want to actually create a shadow DOM for our element. So we can use this.attachShadow method. And let's give it one parameter here called mode is open. And what mode is open means is that we can actually interface with the insides of our shadow DOM from outside of the element. So I can actually show what it looks like. And then starting to use the actual template. So we use this.shadow root and append one child in there, and then we will use the template tag. Template.content, it also every time has a content property that we can use, and then just clone that content and put it deep through. All right, what do you think? Should this work? Yes. All right, I'm as confident as you are. Yeah, cool, it works. So we did 20 lines of code and we already now have a reusable element. And if I open up the developer tools, I can actually see that Hello World has a shadow DOM inside it. I can open it And in here I can see that the styles and the actual HTML are encapsulated in their own shadow DOM. I can, for example, show an example. If I add some styles here, so H1 should have color red, and then I would add another H1 in the index HTML, hello from index. It works just as expected. So all of these CSS rules that we are specifying in here are only working for the elements that we are using in the same shadow DOM. So we can see that there's a color red in here. We can click the style, it puts out here, but then this does not have the color red inside it. Really cool feature. Then I will show one more thing, like working with attributes and properties, and if we want to create, for example, like a data binding system for our element. Let's say I want to specify the text that my hello world element has. So I'm setting up text hello Helsinki. Nice to be here. And wink face or smiley face actually. Of course it's not yet showing, but we can see in the developer tools that the actual attribute has been specified. But some of the things that we want to create here, for example, if we want to allow the same kind of interface by using JavaScript, so we can access the same things using properties, we can put setters and getters for that text attribute, not text content, get text, and this should return the text attribute. So this get attribute and text. And then same kind of setter, set text, and that takes one parameter, let's call it value, and it will just set the attribute text to have the value inside it. All right, cool. So now we can interface with our element both from HTML and from JavaScript side. All right, but right now our element or our attribute is not used anywhere. One thing that we can, for example, create here is to create one static getter for the observed attributes. So observed attributes. All right, and we need to return a new array. And inside this array, we just specify all the attribute names that we want to observe. So every time text value changes, it will call attribute changed callback. So attribute changed callback. Let's specify the do a console log here. Let's just check it out that does it work. All right, and looks like it is doing some console log in there. So this attribute change callback, it will get 3 parameters. It will get the attribute's name and then the previous value of what the attribute's value was and then the new value. So now we can do, for example, that if attribute is text, then we can, for example, set this dot shadow root, and now we are using the shadow root. Now we can use just like some normal query selector in here. So for example, h1 inner text equals new value. All right, and I think that is it. 38 lines, and let's see what we have made in here. So hello Helsinki, nice to be here. Cool, it's showing. Let's check out that does it really see the attribute changes. So hello from Turku. Yeah, it's immediately updated in the view also. As you can see, it's in the text and it's also in the headings 1. Also the same thing with JavaScript. So I can first select the current element. This actually not that, I want to specify this hello world element. All right, hello world element. And as we created the getters and setters, this should have a text getter in here. So yes, text property currently equals hello from Turku. So now we can also create a new value from it, hello from my console. Yes, and it works exactly the same way. So this is pretty much a very simple way of creating your reusable elements in only 38 lines. And what is really cool about here is that I'm using only the web platform, so I'm not importing any external libraries, any extra frameworks. This is just simple JavaScript that we can use in the browsers today. Of course, not in all the browsers, but hopefully during this year we will have them everywhere. So that was everything that I had. I really appreciate your questions and thank you. Do we have questions? Oh, take this. Nice throw.
Sweet. All right. Do you see being able to iterate over these tags and replace something like handlebars?
Yeah, that is one way. For example, the Polymer library that I've used a lot, they use like square brackets and curly brackets in creating like data binding in there. So that is, I would recommend to use like already made library for using that. Yeah, but that's really cool. Any other questions?
Thank you. So I liked your reference to Legos, but my question is, will web components hurt me the same way as Legos do when I step on them?
We need to find out. Yeah, I don't know. Like, of course, if you saw my graph like going up and down with web components. Of course, web components have hurt me sometimes when I'm like with IE11. I'm like, why is this not working? Oh yeah, I don't have the polyfills. But hopefully in the future they will get a lot softer and they won't hurt any of us. Yeah, there's more questions.
All right, thanks. My question is about React. How has the React team reacted to the whole web components phenomena, or how you want to say it?
Yeah. So
do you know like more about it? You seem to be very on top of things with this.
Yeah, I know at least something, not much about, of course, React in this case. But if you look at React documentation, they have like in there like how to use web components in React. But still, like when you start using actually them in React, they are working or they are not working. It requires sometimes some bit more hacking towards that. But I think the worst part is that in normal like React components, if you do, for example, inline styling, you don't really need like Shadow DOM anymore. You have already all the styles encapsulated. You have the elements encapsulated already. So for example, in the case of React, I see that they are like two different ways of tackling the same problem. And at the moment, it doesn't look like it that if you just want to create custom elements and only use them in React, that it would like solve any problems in there. But of course, if you want to create elements and use them in a lot of different frameworks, then I would recommend it. But if only React, then maybe no.
All right, so like a quick follow-up questions about the performance of web components in browsers today.
Yeah. How
do they perform like compared to like Vue or React Fiber or?
Yeah, like if you do web components correctly, then they are like kind of like performing also. But of course, if you take, for example, Polymer library, and you take some elements built by the Polymer library, and also those elements will include more elements inside them and more elements inside them. So I did a test with some like dialog element by the Polymer team, and it already has like some 100 kilobytes of data downloaded already and only has dialog. So, well, yeah, on my experience, like with performance, React has been on top of it, and also Vue.
Yeah, there's been like on a project that I'm working currently, we have the problem with the JavaScript bundle being too large, or it's not too large, but Lighthouse thinks that it's too large.
Yeah.
It's like, I don't remember how much, but under a megabyte anyway, and zipped even less, but there's still like a problem, and it's very hard to make it smaller. So if the bundle will be larger with web components, that's kind of a problem.
Yes.
In some cases.
Yeah, but like, well, of course I can't answer that problem actually, because the web components today have been using, for example, Bower, and using Bower and Webpack doesn't really like go hand in hand.
Yeah, that's true.
So of course, if you would use web components, then they would be imported like lazily after the bundle itself. So yeah, might make sense at some points, but I recommend to test out before production.
Yeah, I'll have to do some testing. Anyone else?
So then, how do you do dependency injection then? Can you share dependencies somehow between the components, or like what one component will load Angular, the other will load another Angular, or how does that work?
Yeah. So the cool part I forgot to mention with the HTML imports is that if you have already imported like some path already, and then you use it again in some other element, it won't actually load it again. So it will use immediately what it has already. So if we have two same files being used, it will only load it once.
Fair enough. But then, like, if you bundle it into your component, then that's a problem, obviously.
If you bundle it, you should only have one version of that element. So, for example, the Polymer team has this tool called Vulcanizer, which like bundles web components in a nice way that they will have only one version of one element per time.
Oh, all right, makes sense.
There's one question behind.
If you can flatten dependencies, how are they versioned? Do they follow Semver or some other scheme?
And then you, of course, it will first check out from, for example, in the Bower JSON or Yarn log files, like what are the dependencies set. But then if there are conflicts, then you just have to resolve them manually that, okay, I will select this dependency from this.
Okay, so it doesn't do versioning, you have to resolve them. Yeah, okay.
All right, guess that was everything.